The 2008 study that was mentioned in that first quotation from Science News that I read you, this was done with fMRI. So what you're reading are changes in blood flow in the brain. It's a slower kind of process than the EEG because it takes blood oxygen about 3 to 4 seconds or so to get to where it was most being used. In this task, so while doing the fMRI, subjects had the task of pressing either this button with this finger or that button with that finger, and it was up to them what to do. And the scientists in the paper claimed that they could predict with high accuracy, the high accuracy part is a quotation, 7 to 10 seconds in advance of a button press, which button the person would press next. And that's I'm going to read that passage to you again. So this is the first one I read. Your mind might be made up before you know it. Researchers have found patterns of brain activity that predict people's decisions up to 10 seconds before they're aware they've made a choice. So the thought is, look, the brain has already made that choice, 7 to 10 seconds in advance, and you don't become aware of it for quite a long time. The result was hard to stomach because it suggested that the unconscious brain calls the shots. Now here's the connection to free will, making free will an illusory afterthought. Okay, so we'll see a problem with that experiment in a minute. Here's a study done by Itzhak Fried and co-authors, a really interesting study. So sometimes when epilepsy patients can't be well treated with drugs, they opt for surgery, and part of the skull is removed. And then if they consent, they can be involved in science experiments where an electrode grid is placed directly on the brain or electrodes are inserted directly into the brain. And then they can do various tasks. With my Big Questions in Free Will grant, we funded one study like this. It wasn't the Fried study. It was a very interesting study. And by the way, there's on PBS a series called Closer to Truth. And there's an 8-episode series on Closer to Truth. And in one of the episodes, you can see our EEG study. Our depth electrode study. It's really cool. Okay, so now the task here is just to click a key on a keyboard whenever you want. That's the task. And they were taking readings directly from the brain, and 800 milliseconds in advance of a key press, they could predict within a window of about 300 milliseconds, so it's not pinpointing it, but they could predict with 80% accuracy when the person would press the key. And what they were also measuring was when the person would say the person became aware of the intention, and that was about 100 milliseconds before muscle motion began and 200 milliseconds before the key made contact with the switch under it. Okay, that's 80% accuracy. That's pretty good. All right, so I said I would describe 3 different experiments, using 3 different sets of technology. And then I would try to explain why we can't really justify the conclusion that there's no free will based on these findings, and I'm going to get to that part now. Always at the end when I give a talk like this, somebody will ask me, what does free will mean anyway? And a nice thing about this talk is we don't have to get so much into the semantics of it because we can see that there are problems just getting to the claim that decisions are made unconsciously in these experiments. And that's the key claim. That's how they get to the conclusion that there's no free will. Well, look, you're not making your decisions consciously, and you need to make them consciously in order to be acting freely. Okay, so now there are 3 different problems I'm going to talk about, and each one is a problem for each of the 3 experiments. The first one is, so back to Libet, what happens at minus 550 milliseconds in Libet's study? That's where the EEG ramp-up starts, and so you should be wondering, well, is that where the decision is made? That's Libet's claim, and it's an important claim to get his argument to go. Well, one question you'd want to ask in that connection then is, how long does it take a decision to do something now, or an intention to do something now, to generate muscle motion? Does it take 550 milliseconds? Might it take less time, for example? Now, we do have already, and we've had for years, indirect evidence about this. So you can do reaction time studies in which a subject knows what he or she is supposed to do when the subject gets a go signal. So it might be when you hear a beep, then what we want you to do as quickly as possible is flex your wrist. Now, to get data that would be even more useful in answering our question about Libet, what you'd want is a reaction time experiment where subjects are watching a clock, in fact, a Libet clock, a fast clock like this, because watching the clock is going to divide attention and it's going to slow down reaction time. And now there is a study like this. It was done by Patrick Haggard and Elena Magno. It was published in 1999, as I recall. And the mean time between the sounding of the go signal and the beginning of muscle motion, it's called a muscle burst, was 231 milliseconds. So the time between intention and muscle motion is going to be less than 231 milliseconds because it takes a little time to detect the beep. And then if the way it works is you detect the beep, that generates the intention that then generates the muscle motion, well, the intention is closer to the muscle motion than 231 milliseconds. That's one study. Here's another one. This is a recent one. It's on my handout. It was done by Trevina and Miller, 2010. It's a study I had suggested back in my 2009 book, Effective Intentions. And the idea is this. So have a study where people have two options. They can press this button or that button. And set it up so that you tell them, don't make your decision until you hear the beep. And the beep, instead of being a specific go signal, like press that button or press that button, is to be treated as a decide signal. So we say, when you hear the beep, decide which button to press and then go ahead and press it right away. And what happened in that study is that there was no difference in pre-tone EEG. So the EEG before the decide signal was the same no matter whether the person then went left or then went right, which is evidence that no decision had been made prior to the decide signal. And the mean time between decide signal sounding and muscle motion beginning was 150 milliseconds. So if the decision is made there, it's really close to the beginning of muscle motion. It's in here somewhere, around 200 milliseconds, rather than way back here. But then if the decisions are being made around there, they're being made during W time, the time at which the person is conscious of making them. Okay? All right. So now back to the Soon et al. Study, the study done with fMRI, where they said that with high accuracy they could predict 7 to 10 seconds in advance which button the person would press next. Well, the high accuracy was 60%. Now that's significant. That's 10 points above chance, but it really is only 60%. And just to illustrate what that amounts to, notice this. If I had a fair coin and you had two buttons you could press and you're going to press one or the other next time, I could predict with 50% accuracy just by flipping my coin, right, which one you're going to press next. And they're doing 10 points better than that. So what are they detecting? I mean, they are detecting something. They're 10 points better than chance. They're not just guessing. What are they detecting? My hunch is they're detecting a certain kind of bias. So in this study, what you're supposed to do is press this button next or that button next. You do it a whole bunch of times. You're not supposed to fall into any patterns, so you have to keep track in a rough and ready kind of way. And I think what's going on is that as you go through the task, you will build up in yourself for the next press a certain bias or inclination that you're not even aware of to go left next time or right. And maybe it's one that just increases the probability that you'll go that way, but not by much. And that's why we get the 60% accuracy rate. But notice that if it's that kind of thing that's going on, it's no problem at all for free will, because it's not as though your brain has definitely decided back then. All it's done is given you a little nudge in a certain direction. A nudge that you could go against, apparently. Okay. So, and then the Fried study with depth electrodes. Well, there the response, the claim is going to be similar. Their accuracy rating is way higher. It's 80%, which is impressive. But the 80% figure doesn't indicate that a decision has already been made at, let's say, minus 800 milliseconds. And it's utterly consistent with the hypothesis that what's going on there is you're getting closer to making a decision to press now, but you're not all the way there yet. You're getting closer in a way that doesn't ensure that you'll go all the way and make your decision at that point in time. And I think that's quite likely. Now, I've made all these points before, and sometimes people will respond, well, even if you're right, let's go back to Libet. That's sort of the simplest one to see because we have our picture. Even if you're right that the decision isn't made here, and even if it's true that the decision is made around here, around the time you say you're conscious of making it, they say, well, the point of no return has been hit back here. And the point of no return is a point such that once you get to it, you can't stop the process in any natural way. Okay? So they could claim that. And so they could say, well, you know, this consciousness of a decision isn't really doing any work because everything's already been settled back then, even if a decision hasn't been made back then. All right. Now, see, this is where it'd be good for you to have the handout because there's a quotation on it from Libet's method. It's about Libet's method in doing the study. I'm going to read it to you. I'm going to read it slowly because it's crucial. In the absence of the muscle's electrical signal when being activated, there was no trigger to initiate the computer's recording of any preceding brain activity. Now, here's the significance of that. If you want to know whether the point of no return is hit back here, what you'd want to be able to do is inspect brain activity, starting from there and let's say halfway to 0 or so, and see whether you can ever find any cases where you get a signal that looks like this, right, this part of the signal, but you get no muscle motion at 0. And what he's saying in that passage that I quoted to you is that he's using the muscle motion itself as the signal to the computer to make a record of the preceding second or so of brain activity. So if you're using the muscle motion to signal the computer to make a record of that brain activity, then you don't have any record of any brain activity that happens when a little bit later there's no muscle motion, right? So he hasn't been able to look for the point of no return. And people have worked on ways of trying to solve that problem, but here's just one more thing about that. This will make it really clear, I hope. So when you do the EEG stuff, you do something called back averaging. And what happens is you need then something to signal the computer to, let's say, save that preceding second of brain activity so you can match it with others and come out with a result. And his signal in the main study was the muscle motion. Now, in that Vito study that I talked about, so there was a signal, and it wasn't muscle motion because there was no muscle motion, right? That was like the snapping the finger thing where you don't actually do it. The signal was the clock hitting the 9 o'clock point. Okay, so you always need a signal when you're doing EEG. Okay, so we don't have good evidence that the point of no return is hit here. In fact, we don't have any evidence because of the way the experiment was conducted. And Libet himself wasn't claiming that the point of no return was hit there because he thought we had veto power. So he wasn't looking for a point of no return. And we don't have good evidence that the point of no return is hit 7 to 10 seconds in advance in the fMRI study or 0.8 of a second in advance in the depth electrode study.